Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In our last video, we know how to get inputs from the primary and the secondary button from the controller, and based on the inputs, we change the color of the cube, either yellow or black. In this video, we will learn how to get input from the trigger button and the grip button. So, for the trigger button, either you can press the trigger button completely inside, or you can up press the button like that. Same thing goes for the grip button. You just either press the whole button completely inside, or you can half press the grip button. Okay, how to get that? Let's start. So we will start from the XR interaction input action that Unity already provides us. If you do not know what is this, please go ahead and watch my previous videos where I discussed how to download this XR interaction toolkit and then how to modify the input actions inside these input actions. So I am going to double click on it, so then we can see all the input actions. So in our last video, we created this primary and secondary button input actions, but in this video we will use the already pre-made input actions for us. So activate means trigger button, and activate value means how much the trigger button is pressed. Similarly, select means the grip button, so it is like either the button is clicked or not, and the select value is how much the grip button is pressed. Okay, so these four options we are going to use in this current video. So let's go ahead and then start writing the script. So we are going to use the input taker script that was assigned to this cube. Okay, so we are going to modify the input taker script. Okay, so here is the script. Now we are going to add some input actions for accessing the trigger button and the grip button. So let's start. Left activate button and right activate button. So these are the buttons for the triggers. Okay, make it capital B. And then we are also going to use some private and public variables similar to before. So let's say private vector3 cube scale. So cube scale is a vector3 type of variable. Why? Because you see the scale has 3 x, y and z variables. Okay, so that's why it is a vector3 variable. And then we are also going to use a public float variable called speed. So what is this? Like whenever we are going to increase or decrease the size of the cube, we need to mention with how much speed the scale will decrease or increase in every frame. So that is determine the speed. So it can be 1 meter per second or it can be 10 meter per second. It's your choice. So that's why we create a public variable. So let's go ahead and then let Unity load. And then here is the speed variable. So maybe like I am going with 1 meter per second. So that means the size of the cube will increase or decrease at a speed of 1 meter per second in every frame. Now you see the activate button and right activate button is already there because that was a public input actions property. So we are going to assign the input actions to our script so that our script can understand what is happening. So let's go ahead and then search for activate. So we are going to use this activate input actions, not the value. We will come to value a little bit later, but right now we are going to use the activate. So activate means either the button is pressed or not. Okay, so left hand, and then for again search for activate, so that is right hand. Okay, so come back to the script and then go to the start method. So the script needs to understand what is the cube scale variable, because we just simply mention the variable name but it does not know what is cube scale. So we need to mention cube scale is the scale of the cube at the starting of the game. So game object dot transform dot local scale. Okay, so that means the scale of the cube at the beginning of the game is the cube scale variable. Okay, so now in the update method we need to read whether the trigger button is pressed or not. So again bool l activate button is pressed equals to left activate button dot action dot is pressed. So this command left activate button dot action dot is pressed will check if the trigger button of the left hand controller is pressed or not, and then that value will be assigned to this variable. Okay, and that is a boolean type of variable because either pressed or not. So this is a boolean type of variable. So again we can copy this thing and then paste for right hand. So R and then right. Okay, so now we know whether the button is pressed or not. So now we need to check if the button is pressed or not. Based on that, we need to increase or decrease the size of the scale, right? So if L activate button is pressed or right activate button is pressed, then this dot game object dot transform dot local scale plus equals to, so we are going to increase the scale of the cube. So plus equals to cube scale. So whatever the scale of the cube is at the beginning of the game, multiplied by speed with the speed multiplied by time dot delta time. So now what is this time dot delta time? So whenever Unity starts any game, it starts a timer at the beginning of the game and it will continuously increase the value throughout the runtime of the game. So now you can understand. So if we multiply this value, it is like going to increase the scale of the cube smoothly in every single frame. Okay, so cube scale multiplied by a speed multiplied by the increasing time of that frame. Okay, so that is the local scale in every single frame. Else, if the button is not pressed, so what we need, if the button is not pressed, we need to see the actual size of the cube, right? So this dot game object dot transform dot local scale equals to cube scaled. So whenever the button is pressed, the size of the cube will increase. Whenever the button is not pressed, the size will come back to its original size, right? So let's go back and then load Unity. Okay, everything is loaded properly, save the scene, and then let's build the game. So now, as you can see, if I completely press the trigger button, the size of the cube is increasing at a constant rate in every single frame. Okay, and if I release the trigger button, it comes back to its original scale. Okay, but the problem is if I half press the button, it does not work at all. If I press like that, it does not work. It has to be pressed like completely inside. So that is the button type of input action. Okay, so now let's see if I just simply press like that, how to get the input. Okay, now to do that, first of all, we are going to comment this thing out because this is just for if the button is pressed or not. So we do not need that particular piece of code. So we can just include some more variables. So left activate button value and right activate button value. Okay, so these are the input action property. So let's go ahead and then add those input actions. Okay, so go to cube and then we are going to add those two input actions. Remember, these are button values. So activate value, so for the left hand, and for the right hand is also similar, right hand activate value. So this is how much the button is pressed, right? So let's go ahead and then we can create another variable called public float activation threshold. Okay, by default I want to give it as like 0.1 f. So what is this? So I would say, like, if the button is pressed more than this value, so that means the code will understand or the application will understand that the button is pressed. Okay, if the button press value is lesser than this value, so the code will understand that the button is not pressed. Okay, so first of all we need to read the value whether the button is pressed or not. So right now we are going to access that value, and remember this is a value, so that means this is not going to be a boolean type of variable, it will going to be a float type of variable. So L activate button pressed value equals to left activate button value dot action dot read value float here. So we are going to read how much the button is pressed. So this read value will get that value, and that is a floating type of variable. Okay, so that's why the variable will be a floating type. So how much the button is pressed, it will be accessed through this command, and that will be stored in this L activate button pressed value. Okay, now similarly we can copy this thing for the right hand also. So right and right hand activate value. So now when we know whether the left activate button or right activate button is pressed or not, so now we can write our code. Left activate button pressed value is greater than activation threshold, so that means the button is pressed, or our activation pressed value is greater than activation threshold, then we can simply copy paste this thing, and else if the button is not pressed, then we want to see the default cube scale. Okay, makes sense? So now again we go back to Unity, let it load and build the game. As you can see, if I half press the button like that, it starts to increase the size of the cube. So if I release the button, it will come back to its original scale. Okay, now I want to show you an interesting thing, that is, if I press the button like that, it is increasing the cube size, right? But it is increasing the cube size with a constant speed. So remember, we get the speed as 1 meter per second, right? But what if, let's say, how much the button is pressed, the speed will also increase in that way. How can we do that? Okay, so let's say I press the button kind of like that, or like slightly. So when I press the button slightly, the speed will be smaller. When I press it like more, the speed will be much more. Okay, so how can we do that? Let's do that. So in that case, we do not need to use a constant speed. What we want to use is the left activation button or the right activation button in place of the speed, because you know these are the value that is coming directly from the controllers, right? And then based on that value, we can multiply that value to the cube scale, and then it will give us a scale that is manipulated by how much the button is pressed. Based on that, the speed will also be changed. So let's do that. In this particular example, what we did is we checked either the left activation button or the right activation button is pressed or not, right? So now we need to just see whether individually which button is pressed. So let's do that. If this, copy this one, if this one is greater than activation threshold and this one is equals to 0.08, so that means if only the left hand button is pressed, so that means we are going to assign the left activation button value in place of the speed. Okay, similarly, if only the right activation value is pressed, so in that case it will be this one equals to 0.0f, and this one will be greater than activation threshold, so that means the speed will be right hand, right? So it will be right hand. Now if both hands are pressed at the same time, so else both hands are pressed, so let's go ahead with like what is the average value of these two. Okay, float value equals to left activation pressed value plus right activation pressed value divided by 2. So I am getting the average of these two values, and then I am going to assign that value here. Okay, and then this will be the same, because whenever no button is pressed, it will come back to its original cube scale. Okay, now let's load it. So come to cube Now you may have a question like, should we consider activation threshold much lower? Yeah, absolutely, you can do that. You can go for 0.1f, or maybe you can go for 0. So that means whenever the button is more than 0, so that means 0 means the button is not pressed. So whenever the button is greater than 0, so that means it is considered pressed, right? So let's patch and run. So now as you can see, when I slightly press the trigger button, the scale of the cube is like slowly moving. As I press the trigger button, the speed of the cube is increasing. Okay, like that. So that's how you get the value from the activate button, and the activate button how much the button is pressed. Okay, so now we are going to understand how to get the input from the grip button. Basically the code is same and you can get the value exactly in the similar way. So what I want to do is, for the trigger button I increase the scale, but for the grip button, when people will press the button, it will decrease the scale of the cube. Okay, and now the code will be very similar. So that's why I will speed up the video over here for sake of time. You can simply follow the video, or you can simply skip the video and go to the last part of this video so that you can see the output of the video. So let's get started. Okay, so I have set up our input taker script accordingly, and before I build, I just want to make sure that you see this. When I press the grip button, I want to make sure that I am decreasing the scale of the cube. Okay, so now go back and then build the game. Actually, I did a slight mistake in this code, because you see, for the trigger button and the select button, for both of them there is this code, right? Whenever the buttons are not pressed, the cube scale will come back to its original scale, right? This is same for the trigger button and grip button. So that's why there was a conflict. So to get rid of that, I can just simply remove this part. Okay, and then instead of doing that, I can cut it and then paste it over here, and then instead of if, we can go for else if. Okay, so now there is only one of this code existing in the code. Okay, so let's go back, let the Unity load, and then patch and run. So now as you can see, when I half press the trigger button, it's increasing the size slowly, and if I half press the grip button a little bit, it's decreasing the size slowly. If I full press it, its speed is very high. Okay, so you guys learn how to get the input from the trigger and the grip button from your controller, and then do something into your game. Okay, so we have learned how to get input from the primary, secondary, the trigger and the grip. Now only the thing is left is the joysticks, the left joystick and the right joystick. So in our next video, we will learn how to get input from the left and right joystick and then manipulate something in the scene. Okay, so I will see you guys in my next video. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.